Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming today. Really happy to welcome Jon Huibregtse back to the Senior Center. Before I turn things over to him, just want to thank our refreshment sponsor today. It is Premier Healthcare at Harrington House. They just took over the nursing facility down the road, so we thank them. All right, well, Jon is here today to talk about the Gilded Age, which from the look of the audience is a very popular topic. So thank you, Jon.
Thanks, Debbie. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming out on this beautiful day. It was refreshing to hear all of you talking before because, you know, when I first started teaching, I'd walk into a classroom and everybody would be talking. And over the last decade, it's turned into everybody looking at their phones when I walk into class. And you know, a room this size, I could walk in and almost hear a pin drop because they were all busy looking at their phones. Anyway, again, welcome. Thanks for coming out. The Gilded Age, and you can tell by the title, I hope, that the past is the present. There are a lot of parallels between what's going on today in America and the Gilded Age. And that was actually sort of the inspiration when I originally created this talk at the start of the year, as we were transitioning from from Biden to Trump, thinking about the parallels. And I know there was a lot of angst out there, probably still is in many quarters. And there's this sense, and I think it's just human nature, that we think of, well, what we're living through now is totally unique, and nobody's ever experienced this kind of thing before. And you go back, and all you got to do is look at presidential electioneering rhetoric, and almost every election, probably since 1800, at least one candidate has said something like, "This is the most important election of our lifetime," and however the vote turns out is going to shape the future, and so forth. So to think that the circumstances we are living in today in America are unique is not really accurate. There are a lot of similarities and parallels between the Gilded Age, which, if you're not sure exactly, the Gilded Age is a manufactured term by historians, but it's approximately the last quarter of the 19th century. Okay, so from about 1875 to about 1900. And there are no specific dates, starting and end dates. There's nothing as, specific as like December 7th, 1941 or 9/11/01. There's nothing that specific. So approximately the last quarter of the 19th century. Now you may go home and pick up a book and start reading, and that historian might date it a little bit differently. And that's just because historians disagree. Historians, we're not like mathematicians, because a squared plus b squared always equals c squared, right? But history is debatable in some areas about some things. So the Gilded Age takes its name. Well, first of all, this quote from Henry James gives you a sense of what people in this book that he wrote called Democracy, this was a novel that he wrote in 1880, said, "The civic duty and the great cause of the Civil War has led to, then led to the squalid pursuit of wealth and office." And I came across that. This was like the last slide I popped in here this morning when I came across this quote, and I thought this really kind of summarized a lot of what's going on today. The name Gilded Age itself, though, actually comes from a Mark Twain novel called The Gilded Age, and it was a satire of the corruption and the xenophobia and racism and all of the evils that Mark Twain saw going on when he wrote the book in the 1870s, and that's where the term Gilded Age comes from. And just so everybody's this thing rises up a little bit here, so start a pool. When I fall down, whoever's got the right time wins the pool. Anyway, or just so everybody's clear, gilded means that it's gold on the surface, and when you scratch down, you get to a lesser substance. It's like kind of throwing a fresh coat of paint over a crappy old wall, and it looks really good until the next rainstorm comes in and the leaks start to show on your fresh coat of paint. So the term was coined by Mark Twain. This cartoon summarizes the Gilded Age quite nicely. It was in the 1880s, the royal feast of Balthazar, Blaine, and the Money Kings. So a couple of things. First of all, Blaine, James G. Blaine, the Continental Liar from Maine, was a power broker, a presidential candidate, and you see him sitting right in the middle of this group of people here. If we had been alive in the Gilded Age, we could probably identify some of those people that are on there. Some names are familiar to you. This person here, I believe, is Andrew Carnegie. One of those two people is Andrew Carnegie. He's on there. Henry Flagler is on there. Flagler was a partner of Rockefeller in Standard Oil. If you've spent time in Florida, there's a lot of stuff named after Flagler in Florida because he was also a railroad magnate who helped to settle Florida. Some of the other people in there are John Jacob Astor, Chauncey Depew, who was a senator and also president of the New York Central Railroad. Jay Gould is in there somewhere, and a guy named Cyrus Field, who probably never heard of. I hadn't either, to be honest with you. He's the guy responsible for laying the transatlantic cable for telegraph, so you can imagine how wealthy he became from laying that cable. And so you see all of the kings eating here, and the paupers down in the left-hand corner as you're looking at that, just begging for something. Third from the left. This one right here. I don't know. Where I found this, they didn't identify everybody in the cartoon, so I'm sorry, I can't answer that. Yeah, there are some things, but those aren't always names. Well, this one says Dylan Morton. I can actually see it much better than on this big screen than I can on my little screen. So it looks like your question, ma'am, looks like Everts, but I don't know who that would have been. Okay. Also Belshazzar. Anybody know? Remember? I'll give you a hint. Anybody remember Sunday school? Old Testament, Book of Daniel. He was a king throwing the feast, and a hand magically appeared writing on the wall that said, "Your kingdom is going to end." And he couldn't interpret it, and he called Daniel in to interpret it. And I believe that's why Daniel ended up in the lion's den, or at least one of the reasons Daniel ended up in the lion's den. So this is a biblical reference to the book of Daniel. Okay, so the wealth was, it's this period of rapid industrialization. Historians first began to talk about the similarities with the past and the Gilded Age way back in the Reagan years. These comparisons first began to appear. And they've ebbed and flowed ever since. Some people said, well, it wasn't really Reagan, but the dot-com boom in the mid to late 90s was really sort of this second Gilded Age. Others said, well, it was right after the Great Recession of 08, 09 into 10. In the end, it doesn't matter when or if it started. I think it's important to look at those parallels and to think about the parallels that exist. So we're going to look at today's talk. This is kind of an outline. We're going to look at 4 areas and draw some parallels between the past and the present. We're going to look at political corruption, economic inequality, Red Scares, and then lastly, xenophobia and racial inequality. So those are the kind of the four legs of the talk today. So let's begin by looking at political corruption. Then and now, and this is one of the very strong parallels, then and now, the parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, were very closely matched in terms of, electing Congress, Senate, etc. They're very closely matched. It's not surprising when we know how closely it's matched that the 2 times in American history we've elected presidents to non-consecutive terms were during the Gilded Age and, of course, Trump more recently. In the 1880s, it was Grover Cleveland was elected to non-consecutive terms. He actually won the popular vote 3 presidential elections in a row, but he lost in the Electoral College, okay? And if we think about today, since 1988, we've had President Bush, the first President Bush, we've had the second President Bush getting elected twice, and we've had Donald Trump getting elected twice. So that's 5 Republican presidents or 5 Republican administrations. Only twice have the Republicans won a majority of the popular vote. In 1988, when George Bush beat Michael Dukakis, and I know in Massachusetts, I hope I'm not stepping on anybody's toes, Dukakis ran one of the worst campaigns in presidential history, okay? Followed closely by John Kerry, and maybe third with Hillary Clinton in terms of running just bad campaigns. That aside, the only other time the Republicans actually won the majority was in 2004, when George Bush won re-election over John Kerry with, I didn't check the number, it was a 50.9, 51%, something like that. It was a very narrow margin. Of course, Trump lost to Hillary Clinton in 2006 in the popular vote. He lost to Biden. And yes, he won more votes than any other candidate in 2024, but he did not get 50% of the vote. Okay, he did not get 50% of the vote. So, the Republicans, at least in terms of winning the presidency, over the last 30-ish years has been very narrow, and in part they've won because of the Electoral College. So in the 1880s, 1890s, many states, I should rephrase that, many cities and quite a few states were controlled by political machines. And these were, both parties had political machines. Neither party had, rephrase that, both parties had good guys, both parties had criminals running political machines. Neither party had a monopoly on virtue or villainy. It was kind of equally split, okay? But political machines actually served a really important purpose besides just getting people elected. There were no social services back in the 1880s, 1890s, and these political machines served these political machines served an important purpose in that they provided a lot of those social services, or things that today we call social services. They provided for immigrants and poor people moving into the cities. They provided jobs. They provided rent or housing, I should say, or they could find housing. They were, show up. You've probably seen this depicted in movies in various forms where, usually it's mob movies today, to be honest. It's a mob guy will show up with a truck full of frozen turkeys at Christmas time and stand on the back of his truck throwing turkeys out into the crowd, that kind of thing. That's what that's what the political machines did. And it was a quid pro quo. The expectation was that if you got something from the political machine, whether it was a job or a tip on a cheap apartment or, a Christmas turkey, or you called the ward boss because your son got thrown in jail for, getting drunk or something and they bailed him out, great, they're happy to help you out. The expectation was that you would then vote for them. And if possible, hopefully vote more than once for them. Vote early and vote often, right? And if they got you a job, the expectation was that you would contribute money to the party, whether it was the Democrats or the Republicans that got you that job, that got you into that position. So the political machines, the most famous of these was Tammany Hall in New York City, was led by a guy named William Tweed that they just called the boss. So there was a boss before Springsteen. And he led that political machine until he died in 1878. The political machine, Tammany Hall, continued on into the 20th century before the last vestiges of it were finally wiped out. Boston didn't have a political machine like Tammany Hall, but it did have a pretty strong Irish-American political machine in this time. In the 1880s, 1890s, it was responsible for electing the first Irish-born mayor of Boston in the mid-1880s, a guy named Hugh O'Brien, which was a testament to the growing power of the immigrant Irish community in Boston. And we can kind of use Boston as a little bit of an avatar for what's going on across the country, in that immigrant groups are gaining more power. And the power that immigrant groups were gaining was one of the catalysts for a little bit later on when we talk about the xenophobia and racism that was present in America. Because, you know, power is, I always describe in class, power is kind of a circular thing, and there's only so much to be had of it. And when one group gains power, like in this case the immigrants, another group loses power. And in the case of Boston, specifically, it's the Boston Brahmins who are losing power and losing their influence. And that almost always causes some kind of conflict. That might be violent, nasty conflict. It might just be sniping in the press. But it almost always causes some kind of conflict. So these political machines were an important part of the political process. They were inherently corrupt. Tammany Hall wasn't the only one. Just two other quick examples. There was one called the Cox machine, which was in Cincinnati, COX, after a politician named Cox, or a boss named Cox. And William Howard Taft, President of the United States, was associated with the Cox machine early in his political career. They helped give him a leg up onto the horse, so to speak. A second political machine that helped elect a president a little bit later on was the Pendergast machine, which was based in Kansas City, Missouri, and Harry Truman got his political start as a foot soldier, let us say, in the Pendergast machine, and they helped get him elected to a position that was, I forget what it was called, but it was equivalent to like a county judge, was Truman's first political office, and that was courtesy of the Pendergast machine. So these political machines were corrupt, but they were just part of the political landscape in the United States during the Gilded Age. So there were also a lot of scandals in the Gilded Age in politics. Here's a quote from Mark Twain. I'll just give you a second to digest that. The more things change, the more they stay the same, right? So yeah, Mark Twain, this is a famous quote by Mark Twain, and I put it at the start here to discuss political scandals. So there's corruption. The political machines, as I said, were almost always inherently corrupt. Tweed and others made all kinds of money. They would force people into contracts. They would charge exorbitant prices for contracts. I think in the spring I spoke here about Boston, New York race to build a subway. Some of you were here for that. I mentioned Boss Tweed there because he thwarted subway building in New York because he controlled the street railways and was making way too much money to allow subways to come in. But there was other corruption as well. I'm going to mention two scandals from the Gilded Age that were huge scandals at the time. One was called the Credit Mobilier scandal. And if you speak French, I apologize. I'm sure I just slaughtered that with my Midwestern accent. What Credit Mobilier was a company that was created by railroad companies, by the movers and the shakers of railroad companies. And this was at a time, this is right after the Civil War. So the scandal itself came to light in 1872, so about 7 years after the Civil War ended. And they were building the transcontinental railroads. Okay, the first transcontinental railroad was completed in July of 1869. So these railroad magnates, men you might have heard of, men like Leland Stanford, as in Stanford University, Collis Huntington, Huntington Museum, and all kinds of philanthropy in LA area, and others, create this Credit Mobilier. It's a construction company to build the railroad. So they're building the railroad, and then they create their own construction company to build the railroad. Well, who's paying to have the railroad built? The government is. So what Credit Mobilier does is they charge the government approximately, these are 1870-ish dollars, about $94 million for construction costs. The actual construction cost was around $50 million. So you can do the math, right? That's about $44 million that they bilked the government out of. And somewhere in my notes here, okay, here's what I was looking for in my notes. I do have to come back to remember some specifics here. $94 million is today equivalent to about $2.3 billion. So the $44 million extra that they charged, about $1 billion, give or take. Okay, and you know what's $100 million among friends? Well, this came to light, and of that $44 million that they stole from the government, a lot of it went into their pockets. Okay, but a lot of it also went to bribe congressmen and others to make sure they didn't look too closely at the bills coming in, and you know they didn't want anybody to audit the books, basically. So they pocket a lot of money. They bribe a lot of congressmen to basically not do their jobs, to be quiet and not look into this. Now, the names of the congressmen that got in trouble, names that aren't familiar with us today at all. A guy named Oakes Ames, who was a Republican from Massachusetts. These next two names will sound familiar because they're famous people today with the same names. One is a guy named James Brooks, who is a Democrat from New York. If you're wondering who James Brooks is, he's creator of The Simpsons and a whole lot of other TV shows. Another congressman who has a name, a famous name today, was a Republican senator from New Hampshire, a guy named James Patterson. And some of you might be more familiar with James Patterson, the author who's written dozens of murder mystery detective. Alex Cross is a James Patterson character. That's a TV show, I think, on Prime, I'm not sure. But anyway, I mentioned those not just for the names, but just to point out one of them was a Democrat, one of them was a Republican. Again, this was not all the Democrats doing bad stuff or all Republicans doing bad stuff. It's both parties involved in this. The New York Sun, as I said, exposed this in 1872. As you can imagine, I could see your faces sort of like, wow, you know, public was really outraged at all of this. Guess how many people actually went to jail for this? 0. Yeah. Remember Too Big to Fail in 08, 09? Pretty strong parallel here, okay? Guys that were behind the scheme, the movers and the shakers of the railroad companies, they just went right on. No consequences at all for them. And, of course, that enraged the public even further, but so what, right? They were millionaires. Today they're billionaires. So what? Okay, they got away with it. It did harm some of the politicians involved. They were censured by Congress, which doesn't mean a darn thing when you get right down to it. It's, you know, a slap on the wrist. It basically just disappeared after that. It created this outrage. There was nobody punished, and everything went on as normal. As I said, similar to the Great Recession, when executives of Lehman Brothers, Bear Stearns, Countrywide Financial, and Washington Mutual never faced any criminal charges for what they did. A few of them faced relatively minor civil charges and civil cases, but nothing of equaling the Yes, a lot of people agree with that. Gentleman here said they should have gone to jail, and yes, a lot of people I think would agree with that. As probably should have some of the people involved in the Credit Mobilier scandal as well. One last scandal in the Gilded Age that caught America's attention was something called the whiskey ring scandal. This one is interesting too, and we'll point out a big difference in a minute. The whiskey ring was this group that was led by a Grant appointee, another general. He was in charge. This guy was name was McDonald, was in charge of collecting revenues, alcohol revenues, taxes in Missouri. And long story short, he gets the good idea of, well, let's just pocket some of what we're taking from the excise taxes. We're just going to take money. We're going to steal basically tax money from the federal government. So they pocketed millions of dollars, McDonald and his fellow conspirators. In 1875, the Secretary of the Treasury, a guy named Benjamin Bristow, launched an investigation, and eventually more than 300 people were arrested, and ultimately 110 were convicted of wrongdoing during the whiskey, or because of the whiskey ring. Grant was never implicated, but it did hurt his reputation. His private secretary was indicted but later acquitted. A private secretary in those days was kind of the equivalent of a presidential chief of staff today. So this is a person with a lot of power. It's not just somebody sitting outside the office at a typewriter answering the phone and so forth. This is a guy who controls a lot of access to the president. As I said, 110 were convicted. Stop and think for a second. How many people in Credit Mobilier, of all these rich guys who pulled off a crime, how many of them were convicted? How many average people like you and I who had low-ranking government jobs, collecting taxes, get convicted of a crime? 110 out of 300 people arrested. The more things change, the more they stay the same, right? Okay. So both these scandals eroded public trust in the government. Loss of faith in the government is a prominent theme in the growth of conspiracy theories. As you all know, we are living through an age with lots of conspiracy theories. Well, the latest was that Trump was dead. I'd kind of tuned out for the weekend, and then all of a sudden I tuned back in, and it's like the number one Google search is Trump dead? Conspiracy theories all over the place. In the Gilded Age, and again, things haven't changed a whole lot. Conspiracy theories were aimed at Catholics. Okay, a lot of fear around Catholicism throughout American history. That one doesn't exist so much today. But the other groups or the other ideas groups, however you want to term it, that were the constant the conspiracy targets of conspiracy theory: communists and immigrants. The more things change, the more they stay the same, right? Okay. So let's think about scandals in our own time. And I'm not going to talk about all of these, but I just took a minute or two to make a slide and list, 7 scandals there over the last 50 plus years. If we go back to Watergate, that was 51 years ago. Watergate, Abscam, Iran-Contra, savings and loan crisis, the Keating Five, Clinton-Lewinsky, Bush, W. Bush administration about lies around weapons of mass destruction, and lastly, violations of the Emoluments Clause. That's the clause in the Constitution that says the president shouldn't take gifts from foreign countries. Like, for instance, I'll just make something up that's too crazy to even contemplate. Like if another country gave the president a jumbo jet, for instance. Just as a for instance. Okay? So these are all parallels, and they all of these things have the effect of causing folks to begin to lose faith in the government and lose trust in the government. And not only does that lead to conspiracy theories, but it is a real sort of chipping away of the foundation of democracy when that begins to happen. So moving on to the next parallel with the Gilded Age and the present is the growth of economic inequality. Was extremely rapid in the Gilded Age. During the Gilded Age, it was rapid industrialization was sort of the economic thing, if you will, of the Gilded Age. It was rapid industrialization. I think the parallel that we might have today, and this might be stretching it, but take it for what it's worth. I think the parallel today is the information revolution and the technology revolution that's going on. I think there's a certain similarity. I don't want to, play a game of Twister trying to make comparisons, but I think that's a fair comparison, at least in some respects. So there is that parallel. During the Gilded Age, you can see some figures here. I want to apologize. The next several slides are just a lot of facts and figures, okay? So I apologize for that. I'm used to teaching history majors, which history majors are almost by our nature math challenged. So I have to put all these numbers in front here. So you can see how these figures kind of tell a story of industrialization in the Gilded Age, okay? The number of industrial workers grew from 1.3 to 4.5 million over about a 30-year period. Similar period, a little bit different, but similar period, factory output went from 1.9 billion to $13 billion, a 600% increase, while the U.S. population approximately doubled during the Gilded Age. Okay. Now, what that means, kind of read between the lines, if you will, part of what this means, this is not the only meaning, but part of what this means is that when output goes up by 600% and the population doubles, this is a crude yardstick of how hard people are working and how many hours they're working and so forth. It's a crude yardstick, okay? I'm sure if any of you are trained in economics, you might be cringing right now at that sort of blithe comparison, but let's go with it, okay? Just roll with it, if you will. Ask for your patience there. The industrialists, the financiers, the men like Rockefeller, Carnegie, Morgan, Jay Gould, Huntington, Stanford, others as well, made fortunes during this period. Rockefeller at one point was the richest guy in the world. Carnegie was slightly behind him. They had fortunes in the hundreds of millions of dollars that would, pale in comparison to what Bill Gates or Musk or the fortune that Steve Jobs left behind. But by standards of their time, this was a huge amount of money. They had the advantage, parenthetically, they had the advantage of no income tax as well, because that doesn't come along until early in the 20th century. So that was a benefit. Nonetheless, they made huge fortunes. And these huge fortunes were made, I would argue, and I think a lot of people would agree, on the backs of working people, on the backs of people who worked 50, 60, 70, 80 hours a week sorry, I'm looking for a date here. In 1900, yes, I heard someone say horrible conditions. Thank you. That's a good segue in to the number I was looking for. In 1900, it's estimated, and there were no national statistics, and if things keep going the way they are, we're not going to have national statistics again soon enough in many areas. But extrapolate local numbers, best guesstimates, 35,000 people died in industrial accidents in 1900. 35,000 people died in industrial accidents. I didn't do the math, but you can all do the math. 366 days a year in 1900, it was a leap year. Divided by 35,000, that's almost 100 people a day dying in industrial accidents. Just to give you a little different yardstick on that, in 2020, there were about only 5,300 industrial deaths in America, which obviously is tragic. It's too many, but it's way less than the 35,000 from more than a century earlier. So one of the ways to look at this is to look at percentages of wealth that are owned by degrees of the population. And this gets very sticky, let's say. Statistics can be manipulated. I had a colleague who would say there are statistics and then there are damn statistics. And then if he was really frustrated...
There's lies, there's damn lies, and there's statistics.
Yeah, she said there are lies, there are damn lies, and then there's statistics. And my colleague would throw an expletive in front of statistics if they were really statistics. But anyway, point is they're a little bit malleable. So I guess the bottom line here is take some of this with a grain of salt. Maybe don't think about the specifics, but think about what they're telling us in general terms, even if they are not precisely accurate, okay? So by 1900, the top 1% of the population owned 51% of all the wealth in the country. The top 1% owned 51%. The top 12% owned 86%, while the lowest 44% owned 1.2% of the wealth. All really hard to sort of get a grasp on. I get that, but I think they serve to give us broad brushstrokes about wealth inequality. Today, the top 10% owns about 71% of the total wealth, while the bottom 50 owns just 2% of the wealth. So these figures haven't changed a whole lot. Those lower end figures haven't changed a whole lot in a century and a half. And just if you're curious, I used the font of all knowledge, AI, earlier. And I asked AI, what's to be in the top 10% of American income, what kind of assets do you need to have? And I was told about $1.9 million puts you in the top 10%. $1.9 million puts you in the top 10%. I know almost $2 million is a lot of money, but when, I don't know what real estate prices are like down here, but where I live, my house is worth almost $1 million, and it's doubled in like the 20 years that we've lived there. My point is, and I'm sure some of you have similar stories, especially if you've owned homes for a long time and so forth. They've risen way more than doubled in the years that you've lived there. So I guess my point was that 1.9 million is a lot of money. If you've got a spare 1.9 and you want to give it to me, I'm happy to take it. But on the other hand, it's also not that much money in the scheme of things. Okay. At any rate, this slide illustrates some of the wealth and how it continues to be at the top of the chain that's not distributed very, very well. The last slide that illustrates this, I think, is maybe even more telling, and it shows, that 7% of our total wealth is now in the top, 7% more of our total wealth is in the hands of the top 25% than it was in 1970. Okay, today, top 25% owns about 87% of all total wealth. In 1970, The top 25% had about 80% of the wealth. So that slide, as much as anything, I think, illustrates how over the last 50 plus years, wealth has moved to the top, how America's economic policies have benefited the wealthy far more than they've benefited the workers. I'm a trained labor historian, so I say workers, but really the middle class, and everybody's a worker in one way, shape, or form, right? Really the middle class has not benefited a whole lot from a lot of these policies. Okay, the last thing we're going to turn to, the last parallel that we're going to turn to is, I'm sorry, we're not quite done with poverty. Not quite done with poverty. In New York City, during the Gilded Age, it was estimated that 2/3 of residents lived in tenement apartments. And this was a particularly bad one. This gentleman here, Jacob Riis, if they ever do a movie on Jacob Riis, I think they need to get the guy that played Cliff Clavin to play Jacob Riis in the biopic. That's just me. I think that looks like John Rathlisberger completely. But anyway, Jacob Riis was a famous photographer. And he went into the New York City slums and took thousands of images of poverty. And he published it in 1890 in a book called How the Other Half Lives. And he published all of these images. And this was one of the images that appeared to show the harsh living conditions. Another image of Riis's was a tenement slum somewhere in New York City. See people there, looks pretty rough living. And this is what poverty looks like today in America, or at least one photo of poverty today in America. So poverty was an issue then, it's an issue now, it probably always will be, no matter what governments do to try to solve it. I think it was Jesus said, "The poor will always be with you," I believe, is a quote attributed to Jesus. At any rate, there are no comprehensive statistics for the 19th century about poverty, but today it's estimated that 11% of Americans, or about 38 million people, are living in poverty in the United States. And it's estimated that about 13% of children are living in poverty. And here's a recent map from the U.S. Census Bureau that shows children in poverty. The deep red burgundy here, you can see that's the most, 22% or more of kids in those deep red or burgundy, whatever, purplish states like New Mexico, Arizona, and so forth. This color of Texas and Oklahoma is the next highest percentage, and on down. So you can take a look at that, let that sink in for a minute. A lot of people living in poverty in the United States, and those numbers are probably likely only to go up over the next decade or so because of current government policies. Okay, so let's move on to xenophobia, or racism, or Red Scares, I should say, Red Scares. We'll come to that quote. This is, if I were in front of a class right now, I'd be standing here going, "Don't read this, wait, okay? We'll get to it. I'm getting a little ahead on the slides there. Anyway, Red Scares. And we are, in my opinion, as a historian, we're living through another Red Scare right now. Most history books would say that the first Red Scare was after World War I, the so-called Palmer raids. It was right after the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, and there's fear that communists were going to take over the United States. Most labor historians and other historians would say, well, no, not really. really the first Red Scare in America was in the 1870s, 1880s. Okay, it was 30 or 40 years before the Palmer raids after World War I. And the trigger for this first Red Scare in America was the Paris Commune in 1871. I won't go into a big history of the Paris Commune. That's not what you're here for. But the Paris Commune did a couple of things that scared the elites of France and, as we'll see, elites in the United States as well. They implemented separation of church and state. They created a remission of high rents. They secularized schools. They abolished child labor. So radical. And they allowed employees to take over deserted buildings, deserted enterprises for people that were in poverty, allowing them to move into abandoned buildings. So maybe not all of those, but I think at least some of those sound pretty reasonable today. Goals that many of us would agree with, maybe just in broad brush strokes, but agree with. The French army came in and crushed the commune after a number of months. They killed somewhere between, estimates are 10 and 15,000 communards were killed, and many more were arrested or exiled. So it's through this lens that American capitalists viewed any form of worker organization, of workers' attempts to reduce hours. Many people, factory workers, worked 60-hour weeks was sort of the norm. Steel workers up into the 20th century worked 70, 80 hours a week. They would do 2 weeks of a 12-hour shift from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. Then they'd get 24 hours off. And then they would flip over and work 12-hour shifts, 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. Okay? So it's no wonder that, at 45, these people were old. And I know most of us in this room look back at 45 as just a fond memory, but they were old men and women at 40 or 45 because of the hours that they worked. So it's through this lens of communism is imminent that American capital saw any push by American workers for greater rights, greater protections. Remember, 35,000 people died in 1900, and that's just an estimate. Anything that American workers did to try to address those problems was immediately dubbed as communism. Communism or anarchy. Anarchy, this political philosophy that there should be no government, everybody's just sort of going to take care of themselves and be good folks, was prominent also. But they view it through this lens, and it didn't matter what the goals of the workers really were. It was viewed through this lens. This is communism. This is, they're trying to take over. They're trying to gain control. And this ignores a lot of things. One of the things it ignores is that employers could collude to set wages. They colluded to set prices. They could even blacklist workers. They could do all of that. But if workers tried anything, they were communists. They were trying to take over in various ways. So the harsh working conditions led to numerous strikes during the Gilded Age. The formation of unions. One of the unions that was formed was called the Knights of Labor. It still exists. You may have heard of it. The other one that was created in this time in the 1880s, that I'm sure most of you have heard of, was the American Federation of Labor, or the AFL, was created in the 1880s. So, as I said, there were a lot of strikes in the Gilded Age, but I just want to look at one strike that occurred in the 1880s and kind of use this as an avatar for the other strikes of the 1880s and as an example of this lens of communism. Okay, so the strike was in 1886, and workers, this was organized by the Knights of Labor, and they were trying to organize a nationwide strike for the extremely radical goal of an 8-hour workday. This was their main goal, was an 8-hour workday. So early in May 1886, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, 7 strikers were killed by the Wisconsin National Guard. demonstrating. 7 people were killed by the Wisconsin National Guard. It's called the Bayview Massacre. A couple days later, workers in Chicago were going to organize a meeting to protest the violence against their fellow workers in Milwaukee, which is about 90 miles north of Chicago. And so they hold a meeting at this place called Haymarket Square. For those of you who know Chicago, Haymarket Square is the corner of Des Plaines and Randolph Streets. If you don't know Chicago, but you've driven through on I-90, you've been very close to the site of the massacre. So what happens at Haymarket is that the workers are meeting. It's a cold, miserable night on Lake Michigan, right off of Lake Michigan. The wind apparently was coming off the lake, and it was really cold. I grew up right on Lake Michigan. It gets really cold when it's, the wind comes off the lake at the right time of year. The meeting is breaking up, and as it's breaking up, suddenly the cops show up to break it up. Okay, the meeting had been peaceful. The speakers had been up on their platforms. I'm pointing at the table here as a platform. They'd been up there speaking. Everything was fine. The cops show up, and this is where all hell breaks loose. Somebody, one of the strikers, threw a bomb into this phalanx of cops coming in to break up the meeting. The cops opened fire. 4 more people were killed. There are also some reports that a number of cops were shot in the back and died that way, which either indicates A, they were running away, or B, they were shot by their fellow cops behind them who panicked. But anyway, 7 cops died, however they died. 4 bystanders died. And the government of both Illinois and especially the federal government views this through the lens of communism. Grover Cleveland said that described this strike as an act of lawlessness and anarchy, and saw it as a threat to public safety and used it as a justification. I would point out that this massacre in Chicago had been peaceful until the cops showed up. Okay, it had been peaceful. And this editorial here, now you can read what's on the screen. Now go ahead and read that. I'm sorry, what? I know you did. I know. I screwed up. I shouldn't have put it up until I was ready for it. But anyway, this editorial in the Chicago Times really sums up kind of the attitude. These are anarchists inspired by foreign radicalism. Again, their main goal was the 8-hour day. Okay, they weren't talking about ownership. They weren't talking about anything that is talked about in the Communist Manifesto other than the 8-hour day was their main goal. Fomenting violence and rebellion. Well, they were meeting peacefully until the cops showed up. Okay, and whipped these Slavic wolves back to their European dens from which they issue or in some way exterminate them. So it's, calling on murdering people, okay? Extermination. There's no sort of ambiguity in the word exterminate, right? Pretty much means one thing. So this is the lens that they viewed all of this, what history books would call radicalism, okay? Really workers trying to get their piece, a little bit bigger piece of the pie that we talked about a few slides ago, and how the 1% controlled so much of that. As I said, that was just one strike. There were numerous strikes during this period, but they all ended with the government in some way, shape, or form defeating the strike. They usually used the doctrine of conspiracy as a way of, that was the criminal charge was always conspiracy, that the workers were conspiring. If you all are my workers, you're mad at me because I'm making you work in bad conditions. You get together to try to, wrest some control back from me. According to the law, you were conspiring to take what was mine as the employer because it's my factory. You work for me, so I really control you. That was the idea of, or the legal foundation for conspiracy, basically. if any of you are lawyers, you're probably like, oh, that was not a good definition of conspiracy. So bear with me, okay? It gets the point across if nothing else, okay? So today we see a resurgence in Red Scare rhetoric in politics, particularly from the right wing of American politics. For example, during the 2020 presidential election, Trump and other Republicans referred to a Democratic health care plan as a socialist takeover of the healthcare system. COVID relief was also criticized as socialism that would lead to laziness and dependence, was the criticism. Two things here. One, Trump approved, before he left office in 2021, President Trump approved $4.2 trillion of COVID aid. After Biden became president, he approved $1.9 trillion of aid. So the right wing is calling the aid that they voted for communistic, okay, a sign of communism, okay? Second thing, the government charges that, the charge that government incentivizes work by giving out aid is also been used a lot. There's little evidence to support that claim, okay? Because if you're on government aid, you're living just above the poverty line. Most people would prefer to work and live much better than just above the poverty line. There are lots of reasons why people choose not to work, and most of them, I think, would prefer to work than collect aid that's just keeps them barely above the poverty line. In June of 2023, after Trump's arraignment on federal charges, he called Biden and the Democrats Marxists and communists. He claimed that Biden, quote, together with his band of closest thugs, misfits, and Marxists, have tried to destroy American democracy. This is rhetoric that sounds like it's right out of the early 20th century or late 19th century. Other Republican politicians like Ted Cruz, Ron DeSantis, and Marjorie Taylor Greene have used similar rhetoric in their attacks on Democrats and their political opponents. The charges of communism or socialism are just as false today as they were in the 19th century. That workers wanting the 8-hour day were referred to communists and anarchists shows the absurdity of that charge in the 19th century. Healthcare reform stems from the belief that people should have access to healthcare. It doesn't stem from socialism or communism. No matter what you think of Trump, he has exploited these economic concerns with his rhetoric. And these concerns among many Americans are real and not imagined. But Trump has been able to ride that fear to the White House twice in the last several years. Which brings us to our last parallel, xenophobia and racism, okay? In the Gilded Age, like today, there was strife over racial issues, okay, including immigration that fostered viral xenophobia in the late 19th century. The civil rights era of the 1950s through the 1970s saw an expansion of civil rights and vigorous enforcement of laws that protected those civil rights. Today, those civil rights that were hard fought for by previous Americans are under attack in America, as the Dobbs decision demonstrates. Voting rights, LGBTQ plus rights, and the right to protest have all been curtailed to some degree recently. And even a small faction of the Christian nationalist movement, some of you have probably read this, are advocating that women's right to vote be repealed as well. Okay, it's just been introduced, it's just been talked about, but that's how these ideas begin, as little ideas that snowball over time. By the end of the Gilded Age, 13 southern states had codified Jim Crow racism through revision of their constitutions. These restrictions included the separate but equal accommodations, which were always separate but never equal, based on the Plessy v. Ferguson decision of 1896. Other restrictions included voting registration or voting restrictions, grandfather clauses, poll taxes, literacy tests, and so forth, okay? I've also heard people kicking around the idea of charging people to vote again as well, which would take a constitutional amendment, I think, but I've heard it talked about. So discrimination, of course, never completely disappeared. But at least some of the more obvious violations of civil rights were prosecuted during the civil rights era. Recently, many of these problems have again gotten worse. In 1980, Reagan delivered a speech in Mississippi where he referred to states' rights, which many people saw as a dog whistle issue, really anti-civil rights, coded language implying that the federal government would again pull back from protecting people's civil rights. Several states have recently enacted laws that limit the teaching of history, particularly aiming to exclude contributions of Black Americans, Native Americans, and other marginalized groups. You might have heard that initially a few weeks ago, the Department of Defense scrubbed its website of all references to African American veterans. It scrubbed any reference to the Navajo code talkers during World War II. Were all scrubbed from the website. Then after people complained, they said, well, we didn't really mean to do that, and they put at least some of it back up on their website. So really trying to marginalize these non-white groups. A couple of at least one of the classes I taught at Framingham State, I probably could not teach in Florida because it focused on civil rights in the United States. In 2023, states passed more than 75 anti-LGBTQ bills, restricted gender-affirming care for transgender youth, banned transgender students from playing sports, and limited classroom instruction about LGBTQ issues. Immigration. First of all, Trump's idea of a wall wasn't exactly original. Cartoon from 1882 that shows building a wall. A couple of things to look at or think about on this cartoon. One is look at the first guy carrying the brick. Okay? Because he's got the little pipe in his hat. As we all know, Irishmen always carried pipes in their hats, so we know that that's an Irish person. But he doesn't look very human, does he? He looks kind of like cross between some sort of ape and human. Same is true for the African American. This guy right here doesn't exactly look human, does he? Looks kind of a caricature of some sort. We've got another guy back here wearing a dunce hat. Okay. So the rhetoric in the 1880s, 1890s during the Gilded Age, a lot of it was anti-Chinese. They were the recipients of the most virile anti-racism. There were riots throughout the American West against Chinese Americans. By the Gilded Age, there were all of about 100,000 Chinese in America, but there were protests against them. You see this one in Tacoma. There was a massive riot actually in San Francisco that killed several people, caused about $100,000 in property damage. $100,000, more than $1 million today. It's $100,000 then. This was typical, and what we see today is just a repeat. Circumstances have changed some, but in many ways it's just a repeat of what we saw 100 plus years ago. One of the first things that Trump said when he descended his elevator to announce his run for the presidency, he said, when Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're sending people that have lots of problems. They're bringing those problems to us. They bring drugs. They're bringing crime. They're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people. And this has been the cornerstone of his shtick ever since then. Again, this level of anti-immigration, anti-immigrant is nothing new in American history. Trump probably wouldn't care to know that after the Haymarket Massacre, it was Germans who came under the lens of being anti-American, and Germans were said to be un-American, too loyal to the Kaiser, and this was before World War I. This is 40 years before World War I, or 30 years before World War I, and were a threat to Anglo-Saxon values, okay? So the rhetoric just changes about which group it gets aimed at, okay? And, 120 years ago, it was Germans and Slavs who came under criticism for being anti-American. Of course, there was the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which banned all Chinese from entering the United States. So in conclusion, wrap this up. In conclusion, one last cartoon to show the anti-Chinese rhetoric. See the typical, air quotes around typical, American home here on the right. And this was the stereotype of what Chinese immigrants lived like. And notice this arrow here, these two guys are eating rats. That's why I put that arrow in there so you could see that. So, that was the rhetoric then. And while it's somewhat different now, there are a lot of similarities between what we heard then and what we see now. So, in conclusion then, there are many differences between the Gilded Age and today. I think the most significant difference is that today the United States is a military superpower, which it definitely was not during the Gilded Age. And the potential for war with another military superpower is real and dangerous. Another major difference is that the ability to spread falsehoods has grown exponentially since the Gilded Age. And think about the story from several months ago during the presidential campaign about the immigrants in Ohio eating house pets and kidnapping people's dogs and cats out of their backyard. And it spread like wildfire. People on the ground. The Republican governor of Ohio, Mike DeWine, and others were saying, no, this is not true. This is nonsense. But Trump and Vance kept saying it, and it kept going, and people believed it. Okay? So that has changed. That ability to spread lies exponentially faster than it was 120 years ago. One of the downsides of the internet. We've all heard that those who don't know history are condemned to repeat it. I'm not sure that history, I know that history never completely repeats itself. History is like a snowflake. They're all similar, but yet they're all different, okay? So let me offer 3 ideas to think about as you head out. First of all, people are people, okay? Regardless when and where. Go back and read the ancient texts. People are people, okay? We've changed in some ways, but we're all still driven. A lot of people driven by the same desires for power, for money, lust, and other motivations. That hasn't changed. Okay, I think that started about Genesis 1 verse 3. Okay, well maybe Genesis 2 after Adam and Eve were around. At any rate, people are people. I said that all the time in classes. People are people, regardless of religion, regardless of race, regardless of country of origin. People are people. Okay. The other side poses an existential threat to America. I put that in quotes because certainly both sides feel like that today, and both sides felt like that in the Gilded Age as well. They were certain in the Gilded Age that if you're a Republican, certain that if the Democrats ever got in power, the country was going to hell in a handbasket. The Democrats felt the same way, and I think that is the same, pretty similar to today. So it's really ahistorical to think that our times are totally unique. They are not. There are differences, important differences, but there are important similarities. And then lastly, the Gilded Age came to an end when good people on both sides, and I mean both sides of the political spectrum, both Democrats and Republicans at the end of the Gilded Age, became fed up with the corruption, greed, xenophobia, and racism. The Progressive Era followed. Shortly after that was the New Deal, and I could have, if I had more room and I didn't want to fit this all on one slide, I could have also included the Great Society of Lyndon Johnson in there as well. Were results at least in part, to the Gilded Age and the problems of the Gilded Age, particularly the Progressive Era, and how that was a reaction to the Gilded Age and the corruption and so forth of the Gilded Age. I'm out of time. I think I'm losing my voice as well. Yes, but questions.
Okay, what I wanted to say is your first picture really moved me, and what I wanted to say is at 1 o'clock today at the Rose Garden, they're opening the new Rose Garden, and all the billionaires, except for Elon Musk, they're going to have lunch, supper, and anybody that's anybody is going to be there. So you could use that as a picture of what's going on today. That's all I wanted to say.
But you won't be there, so everybody who's anybody isn't there.
Did you get an invitation?
Oh gosh, no.
Elon Musk did not get an invitation.
Not surprising.
But anyway, sorry.
That's okay. Other questions or comments? Yes. Yes.
I'm just, the question is basically to you, since you've been involved for history for many, many years, is education of the younger people today about what is going on and what has gone on in the Gilded Age, the current age, should that be more of a point in education?
Okay, his question was about education, and the gist of it is, are kids today getting educated about this, and should they be? And I think the answer to that is, first of all, I can't say for sure because I don't teach K-12. Okay, but not enough, and too much of the, and this is my opinion, it seems like much of the education is focused on what I call the patriotic catechism, rather than learning really what was happening on the ground in a lot of instances. And yes, I think it should be taught more. But the prevailing sentiment among education, especially as Trump's agenda is being more implemented, is that you can't talk about race in American history. You can't talk about these other things. Basically, what a lot of people want taught is what I call the patriotic catechism. Like, isn't America great? Didn't we do great things? To which my response is, yes, absolutely. But we've also done some bad things, okay? And we need to be aware of both of, the scales of history.
The second point is, I think a lot of it has been relevant to the fact that the voting age has changed. I mean, when we voted, we had to be 21 years old, and now it's down at 18. And so they're experiencing things, and also the fact that civics is not K-12. It isn't even taught in school.
Not taught very much, no. I'm not sure what the voting age has to do with that. I mean, you're absolutely right about the voting age being lowered, but that demographic does not vote very much anyway. That 18 to 21, actually 18 to 30 demographic does not vote very much. So, thank you for your questions. I'm sorry. Thank you.